make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
What we discovered, though, is that libido is a symptom. It's not the problem. And I'm going to name 5 things, okay? So just get ready. When there's high marital satisfaction, when they feel emotionally close during sex, so she doesn't feel used, when there's no porn use, when there's no sexual dysfunction, and when she frequently orgasms during sex, frequency is not a problem. Libido is not a problem. So if there's a libido problem in the marriage, you need to ask what is actually going on, because it's not a libido problem in the vast majority of cases. It's something to do with those 5 things.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I am joined by Pastor Josh Bertram.
Yo, what's going on, Will?
That was a long in the biz. They call that
delayed, dude.
They call that a pregnant pause.
Yes, it was quite pregnant.
Yes, but this week we are actually talking with Sheila Wray Gregoire. She is the author of 11 books, including The Great Sex Rescue, the host of the Bare Marriage podcast, and the founder of To Love, Honor, and Vacuum. This week we're going to speak with her about her new book, She Deserves Better. Here it is in the flesh. Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex. Whoa, we've all got it. It's the book trio. Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up. Boy, that's a tongue twister. So welcome to the show, Sheila.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, welcome.
Yeah. So, we have so many questions, and the first question that's not necessarily related to your book, it's more related to like the process of writing a book. So you wrote this book with your daughter.
Yes.
And it's really weird because you've also written other books like with your daughter, like The Great Sex Rescue.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just sitting as I was reading your book, I was just thinking to myself, like, what was that like? Because I mean, I would never want to talk about sex with my parents ever.
That would be super awkward
under any circumstance. But like, here you are writing a book about it. So maybe you can talk to us about like how did you teach your kids about the birds and the bees? Because that had to have been an interesting discussion.
Oh, I did it really badly. It was just awful. I took Rebecca away when she was 10, and we listened to the CD series that talked about what sex and your period and all of this. And she came away from that thinking, not understanding why men would have to scratch down there, because it was explained that the penis was like a finger. So she didn't understand how that worked.
Wow, that's funny.
Yeah, so I made lots of mistakes. I made many mistakes with my younger daughter too, but the good thing is we could always still talk. And so even though I didn't do a great job when they were 11, it didn't matter. We had a good relationship and we could keep talking. And this whole thing got started for us. I've been blogging about sex and marriage for years. I started off as a mommy blogger. The more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I kind of became this Christian sex space, which no one grows up thinking, you know what I want to do when I grow up? I want to be the Christian sex lady, because that is just weird, right? But I was doing this all through their teen years. And then when Rebecca graduated from university, she was home. She was looking for work that she could do while she was pregnant. And I had been blogging, and we had started to notice some scary things because I started to read some other evangelical books, which I had never done. I was afraid of plagiarizing. And when I did, I saw how badly these books talked about sex. And so we decided we would do huge research projects and actually study this, because we thought, hey, let's take Jesus at his word. I know that's radical, but he said that a bad tree can't bear good fruit and a good tree can't bear bad fruit. So let's measure the fruit of the stuff that we're teaching. And that became The Great Sex Rescue. And now She Deserves Better. So there's 3 authors. Rebecca did most of the survey design because that's what she's trained in. She did our focus groups and she did a lot of the editing. I did the writing, and Joanna Sawatsky did the stats. So there were 3 of us for both books.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
And I suppose, writing the book, especially, She Deserves Better. It implies that, a young Christian girl, may not, may be or may have been taught wrong about certain things about sexuality and whatnot. So like, was the book more or less like a, like an admission or like a, a personal intervention that you can provide for your daughter? And if not, maybe you can just kind of tell us what inspired you to write this book.
So after we wrote The Great Sex Rescue, where we address some of the big teachings that are prominent in evangelicalism that lower women's orgasm rates, lower arousal, lower libido, increase rates of sexual pain, lower rates of marital satisfaction. If you go on Amazon right now and you read the reviews, there's like 2,200 of them or something. Over and over again, people are saying, I feel so validated. I feel seen. This is great. But then those same people came back to us and said, but now I have no idea what to do with my kids because I grew up with so much toxic teaching. I don't want to pass that on, but I also don't want to tell my 14-year-old, go do whatever you want. Like spread your wild oats, right? Like we need to figure out what is actually healthy. What does following Jesus actually look like? And so we did another project, 7,000 women this time, to look at how their experiences in youth group, the teachings they heard growing up, the sex ed they heard, how that affects women long term in terms of, again, marital sexual satisfaction, the likelihood they'd marry an abuser, their long-term self-esteem, etc.
That's amazing. So when you were doing all this work, were you shocked by what you found, or were you, I mean, obviously you would have been validated if people were saying like, oh, this is exactly what I've experienced, but were you shocked when you started seeing all the things, or did you basically predict that? The kind of results that you'd find?
I didn't have a lot of surprises. Like we knew certain things were going to be harmful and they were. I think what surprised me, especially with the most recent book, was the size of the magnitude of the harm. Like, let me give you an example of some of the worst. The modesty messages that we give to teen girls. So we measured 4 different iterations of them. Ideas like boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand. A boy can't help but lust if a girl is dressed like she's trying to incite it. Girls have a responsibility not to be stumbling blocks to their brothers by what they wear. A girl who dresses immodestly is worse than a girl who doesn't. So we measured those. And when girls believe that as teenagers, they have a 68% higher chance of marrying an abuser. They have a 52% higher chance of experiencing sexual pain or vaginismus, and that's a sexual dysfunction disorder. We found an incidence rate of 23% among evangelical women, which is about 2.5 times the rate of the general population. And it's long been known that this is largely an evangelical problem. And we've identified several key beliefs that contribute to it. And the modesty message is huge. So when we tell girls that boys can't help but lust after you and you have a responsibility to keep boys from sinning, we do incredible harm to our girls.
Wow. And so what is it like? All right. Because I grew up in this, right? So I was, pastor's kid. And then when I was in youth group, my dad was in denominational leadership, so I wasn't at a church that my dad was pastoring. But I did, I had the ministry, experience and the expectation, certainly the purity culture, going to conferences where guys would be like, well, we were both virgins and then we came together and had sex and it was the most like magical evening in the world and everything. Angels were singing and all this stuff. And I'm like, dang, dude. And basically I decided very early that I was not a pure person and that it didn't really matter what I did. I just couldn't control my thought life or whatever it was. So I was like, I'm done. That must be for someone else. Like this whole idea of like what purity means and all that stuff. Like, and I grew up in a Christian home and I wonder like when you've seen this negative correlation, negative impact on women, what do you imagine, or maybe you've seen, what's the impact on boys? Do they like, how does this connect? between?
I think there's several things that have happened. So we did a large survey of men too for our book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, which came out last year. And one of the big issues we found is that men have largely been taught you are not capable of controlling yourself. So let me give you some examples. Every Man's Battle, huge book series, right? Sold 4 million copies.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So that book series says, and I quote, we find another reason for sexual sin among men. We got there naturally simply by being male. It also says men don't naturally have that Christian view of sex. And so the whole idea behind that book series is that male sexuality and the objectification of women are one and the same thing. And that men don't actually want intimacy. Men just want physical release. And when you teach that to guys, guess what happens? Like when you
kind of, hey, makes sense.
Yeah, when you teach guys, you are entitled to sex because you have sexual needs. Your wife is there to fulfill your sexual needs. You create men who are very unlikely to have a very good sex life because they're going to be chronically dissatisfied with their wives, and they're going to have very poor marriages because they don't understand what intimacy is. So that's one problem, is you create a sense of sexual entitlement, which isn't healthy. It honestly isn't. And there's such a better way of looking at it. The other issue is we cause a tremendous amount of shame and helplessness on young boys. So, you're 12, 13 years old. You're starting to notice, hey, that girl has a chest. I like that chest.
Yep.
That is an attractive chest. And you think, oh my gosh, I am sinning. I am a big bag of disgusting grossness because I have just lusted.
Totally.
And we have conflated.
With the second look, you can look once. But if you look twice, that's when you're getting sent to hell.
But it's conflating noticing with lusting. Like, noticing is not a problem. Jesus never said whoever sees a beautiful woman or whoever notices that a woman has a nice figure has lusted after her.
Right.
Jesus said whoever looks with lust. So it's a deliberate action paired with a deliberate mindset. And I think we have taught boys that they are sinning merely by existing. And we've created this. And so if that's true, if guys are sinning every time they notice a girl is beautiful, then they're helpless. And the only option is to cover up all the girls around them. And that does a tremendous amount of harm to both boys and girls.
That's great. I did hear somebody famous once say that, like, if you're famous, you can do all these things. You can start kissing on them, grab them by the whatever.
Oh, yes. Who yes, I remember hearing that too.
And I'm wondering if maybe, this individual is just a victim of that sort of like, I don't know, that the thing that you're just talking about, how they are raised. Cause for me, so I wasn't raised in a Christian household. I was atheist better part of my life. My wife is actually the one that brought me to Christ, and my wife is a PK. It's actually her dad was the one that married us. And I remember, like, a lot of the stuff that I see in her book, I see reflected in my wife early on in our marriage, because, like, I think my wife is smart. She's extremely beautiful. I call her hot, and like, and early on, I used to be like, feel free to show a little. I don't know, shoulder or whatever, because she also grew up Mennonite as well. So, so I would tell her, feel free to dress, a little bit more sexy because I like looking at you because you're my wife, and I remember her telling me that, she was always raised to be very modest, and to not, tempt others. And I never really quite understood that. So from a person that didn't grow up in the church and hearing this from, his then wife or now wife, like, and somebody I'm extremely attracted to, like, it just didn't seem fitting. So like, but now she's going through this process of kind of deconstruction. And my question to you, because I think it relates to my own wife, is, how much has your book contributed to, women's, deconstruction, especially as it pertains to kind of their place in the church and, how they dress, how they look, how they speak, or if they can speak in front of the church?
Yeah, what we look at in She Deserves Better is not only the purity culture messages about modesty, about consent, about how it's your fault if he goes too far because you were supposed to stop him. Those messages that the girls heard, but also the bigger questions of, like, do women take up too much space? Are women's voices a problem? Um, is it okay for women to have boundaries and to say no to things? These are questions that we often struggle with because we're taught, Jesus gave up everything for you. So how dare you want something for yourself? You need to be willing to give up everything for other people. And the idea of living a boundaryless life is very dangerous. It's not healthy. It's not even what Jesus did. Jesus walked away from the crowd so many times because he's like, nope, got to move on. Sorry. And so understanding that God values you. He values your voice. He values your opinion. He put you here for a reason. That's a message that a lot of women didn't hear. Now, a lot of boys didn't hear it either, but even more women didn't hear it because we were taught things like girls talk too much and girls need to be silent. We actually measured that belief. That's one of my favorites. So that was told a lot in Focus on the Family's Brio magazine to girls, that boys don't like girls who talk too much and girls talk too much. So you need to be quiet. So we asked women, hey, when you were teenagers, did you think that girls talk too much? And most women did. And we asked them, hey, do you think girls talk too much now? When you believed as a teenager that girls talk too much, you're way more likely to marry an abuser. You have way lower self-esteem. And even when you are married, when you grow up and get married, if you both work outside the home, you are way more likely to do all the housework. Like, it's incredible the things that are related to this, because think about it. If you think that girls' words are a problem, then what you're saying is my thoughts and feelings and opinions are a problem. They don't matter as much as his. And if you believe that, you're likely to marry someone who agrees with you.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's really crazy.
It's like that correlation. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, because I was wondering, and I was trying to process, like, okay, you hear these things like girls talk too much, which is just surprising, because some of the stuff, like, I'm shocked by that these messages were given, because I didn't see them personally growing up. That doesn't mean much. But it's just so shocking to me, because I felt like I know evangelical culture. I grew up in it, blah, blah, blah. But it's like there's so much of it I'm finding now that was even way, way worse than my experience. Way worse than my experience. I had a pretty mild experience, I think, in some ways. And part of that, well, anyway, I don't need to get into all the theories there, but a lot of it had to do, I think, with my dad and my parents and how they kind of talked to me about stuff. They're pretty reasonable people along those lines, for sure. But I wonder, like, I was trying to figure out, how do you figure out, like, what is the actual causal connection? And you kind of alluded to it there at the last part of your statement. But dig in a little bit more to the causal connection between someone hears, hey, girls talk too much, and now 20 years later, they marry an abuser. What's the connection there? How do we know that is a real connection there, and that it needs to be corrected?
Yeah. So, okay. This might be a little bit complicated because we'll get into survey design. But when we were writing our survey, we looked at a number
we like complicated.
We looked at a number of what's called previously validated question sets, and we tried to use as many of those as we could, because for instance, we used a previously validated question set on self-esteem, a self-esteem scale, because then if we're using the same scale that other surveys have used, then our findings also relate to all of these other studies. So if they've done how this self-esteem study relates to mental health, we can make broader conclusions. So it's always a good practice when you're writing surveys. And the idea that women talk too much, or that women's voices are a problem, has been used multiple times in as measures of internalized misogyny. So the idea that women ourselves think women are not as important as men. And when you combine that with what the church has taught about how women aren't supposed to speak, you really see it played out. And internalized misogyny, so the idea that women aren't as important, is highly linked to, marrying abusers, lower self-esteem, just not standing up for myself. And you know what?
That makes
There's
so
another
much
funny
sense.
part of it too. Did you the whole thing's because okay, what if girls actually do talk too much though? Like, what if girls do talk a lot? So is it even
How do
true?
you even know?
Well, okay, let me tell you the science behind it. In 1983, James Dobson made a claim that women speak 25,000 words a day while men only speak 12,000 or something like that. And his point was, ladies, when he comes home from work, he's already said all of his words for the day and you've hardly said any of yours. So you're going to be tempted to just talk at him and you need to give him space. So James Dobson used that to say women don't talk to your husbands. Leave them alone. Gary Smalley came out with a book where he said 50,000 words versus 25,000. Luann Brizendine said 14,000 versus 7,000. Like the numbers kept changing, but it was always women said double. And so scientists started to look at this and said, where are the citations? There are no citations for any of this. Nobody is citing any study. So then scientists began to do studies.
Yeah.
And we have meta-analyses of this now. And guess what? There is no statistical difference between the number of words that women say a day versus men. There's no difference.
So they basically just made it up.
Yes. The only time there's a difference is when you're in a mixed group. So both men and women. And in that case, men say way more than women. The only time women say the appropriate amount based on their percentage in the group is when there's at least 80% female. If it's anything less than 80% female, the men say more than their fair share. So it's not that girls talk too much. It's that we need to give our daughters permission to speak up.
That's so crazy. So you know, on the subject of surveying, I mean, you all did a gargantuan amount of work and research to get these numbers, and I think it's amazing. But I'm curious if like what safeguards did you put into place to make sure that you're not just, you know, like surveying or looking for the answers that you already thought you had, you know, so like the confirmation bias, and maybe, you know, added on to that, what survey or what result surprised you the most?
Okay, so there's a difference between what we would call frequency stats and what we were actually doing, which was far more odds ratios. So let me explain. A frequency stat would be...
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So we found one of those. Well, let me back up. Sorry. Let me back up even more. We did our surveys through Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So we got ethics approval. Our data sets are up at,
Nice.
at the ARDA with Andrew Whitehead. We're working on several peer-reviewed papers. So we're really trying to raise the bar on what counts as research in the Christian community, because
That's
a lot
so
of people,
good. That's awesome.
a lot of people have done research and they haven't done it to academic standards. So we've really tried to do that.
And it just looks crazy, and people they don't respect it. Anyway,
right.
Go ahead.
Exactly. So when you're looking at frequency stats, so you want to know how often something happens. So for instance, we found that 18.7% of women reported being sexually assaulted or abused as teenagers in church. Okay, that's a frequency stat. That's how much it happened. We can't guarantee that that is accurate because we didn't have a representative sample. We had a select sample, right? So our frequency stats, I think they're pretty good because we had so many people. And in our survey of 20,000, we had, I don't know how much I can explain this. We had something called external validation, which is our frequency stats were validated by other studies that found similar frequencies.
Gotcha,
So
yeah.
But what we were really interested in was something where that doesn't matter as much. We were looking at odds ratios. So we were saying, let's take two groups of people who believed something and people who didn't believe something. And then let's see how that affects something else. So we're going to take girls who did believe the modesty message as teenagers and women who didn't believe it when they were teenagers. And we're going to follow them and see how that affects marital and sexual satisfaction. And so for that, it's not as important to get like a representative sample necessarily. What's really important is to do the stats right. And that's why we did such high level stats, to find out if there's for sure statistically valid correlations, et cetera.
Yeah, totally.
So,
yeah.
cool. And I guess the result, like did you guys have any findings that surprised you, or that challenged your initial hypothesis going into it?
For She Deserves Better, I think the really big thing, as I said, was the magnitude like how bad the modesty message was, and some of the other messages. For Great Sex Rescue, our surveys for Great Sex Rescue, the thing that surprised me, and it really changed the way I talk about sex, was that libido is not a problem. We all think libido is the issue, right? We all think if some couple has a sex problem, it almost always is that one person wants sex and one person doesn't. And so the problem is we need to figure out how to get the person who doesn't want sex to have more sex. So we need to help them see how great sex is. We need to boost their libido, et cetera, et cetera. What we discovered, though, is that libido is a symptom. It's not the problem. And I'm going to name 5 things, okay? So just get ready. When there's high marital satisfaction, when they feel emotionally close during sex, so she doesn't feel used, when there's no porn use, when there's no sexual dysfunction, and when she frequently orgasms during sex, frequency is not a problem. Libido is not a problem. So if there's a libido problem in the marriage, you need to ask what is actually going on, because it's not a libido problem in the vast majority of cases. It's something to do with those 5 things.
It's one of those 5 things.
Yeah.
And they are, say them again.
So high marital satisfaction.
High marital satisfaction.
She frequently orgasms during sex. No sexual dysfunction. So no erectile dysfunction, no sexual pain, no porn use, no porn use in the marriage. And they feel emotionally connected during sex.
Is that porn use? Like, is that targeting men, that the men aren't using porn use? Or
both.
Both.
Like
both. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Well, I mean, that makes sense.
Now, just to clarify, like, so on the porn use issue, like, does that include, like, I don't know, like Skinamax? You know, like when I was younger, you know, like Cinemax, their nighttime programming.
Right, they had the 2 different types.
Very.
We only asked pornography, and we let people define what it was themselves.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Oh. And I only say that kind of with a preface. So this would be the first time I've said this in the show, but growing up, like I grew up around porn. My dad used to sell porn, like VHS tapes, and it was almost like a Columbia House thing, like that he used to run. So there was always porn in my household.
Okay, you can borrow this, and then we can.
Oh yeah, it was bad. I used to sell them to my friends in high school. my dad's passed long, so he won't know this. But
those were your entrepreneur.
Yeah, there you go.
Entrepreneurial days.
Yes.
That's so funny. You know. So one of the themes that comes out in your book and books like this is the idea of boundaries, right? Setting them in relationships, stuff like that. So to make sure that you have the kind of, relationship you want, to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. Mm-hmm. I assume this is very important for both partners, both sexes in the marriage. Is it more important for one than the other? How do boundaries help us in a marriage?
I think
in our marriages. What are we talking about there?
So the root of boundaries is understanding that you have value, because and that you matter. Your opinions, your needs, your wants matter. Because when we live boundaryless lives, what we're really saying is everybody else's comfort and preferences matters more than mine, and that's not biblical, right? Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." Like, we each have value. And yet we have often taught in church that you don't have value, or that you should value others so much. So there's that acronym that many people grew up with, JOY, right? Jesus first, others second, you last. And if you so you're always supposed to put others ahead of yourself. And you can run into a lot of problems in relationships, and your self-esteem really falls when you believe that other people's comfort matters more than anything you might be going through. And so helping our kids value themselves and drawing boundaries is a really good practice. We tell the story of a youth group experience my oldest daughter and co-author Rebecca Lindenbach had. So she was about, let's say, 15, 16, going to youth group. It was one of those stupid events where you stay overnight at the church. I don't know why people are always doing that, but they were doing this sleepover. And at the sleepover was this 18-year-old guy who had been known to have sexually assaulted several girls at his high school. And he was seriously creepy. And the girls were not comfortable with him being in the church overnight. So Rebecca went to the youth leader and said, this is not okay. And he told her that she was being judgmental and that didn't she know that this might be the only way that he would learn about Jesus. And so she needed to not be so judgmental about weird people. Now, it wasn't weird that she was upset about. It was dangerous, but he didn't care. And he felt that she was putting up too many boundaries. So all the other boys in the youth group put it upon themselves to do the buddy system with the girls. So the girls were never alone in the church with this guy, but the youth leaders didn't protect them. And these are the kinds of stories we hear about over and over again.
Wow.
Is girls are told you shouldn't have boundaries because you may be the only Jesus that this person ever sees. And so why would you risk this person not coming to salvation just because you feel awkward or you feel in danger?
That's crazy. Yeah. And it's, again, I'm going to go back to my wife. So I wasn't a Christian when I met my wife. I think I told her I was one just because I really liked her. But like, under normal circumstances, she would have never married me. I'm not saying she wouldn't have married me if I wasn't a Christian, but like, the life I lived prior to meeting her was not one that her father would have approved of. I'll just say that much, and, but she took a chance, and I don't think that she sacrificed, any boundaries or anything like that. She just trusted that God, was going to put this person in her life that she would spend the rest of her life with. And up to this point, 15 years later, like it still holds true. So, but I'm interested in hearing more about some of these stories that you heard from women, because I can imagine that these stories, had just a powerful effect over like your writing, and just your life and how you kind of think about, the contents of what your book is about. So can you maybe, give us another story that really impacted you, and how did that kind of change, the direction that you wanted to go with your book, if it did at all?
Yeah, I think that the worst things we heard in our focus groups were story upon story upon story about date rape that was never identified as such, and that youth pastors really mishandled. So we opened our consent chapter with the story of Vera, who was dating a guy from school who wasn't a Christian. One afternoon, he took advantage of her when she had a migraine and she was resting, and he raped her. But she didn't have words for what had happened. She didn't understand. She was really confused. She went to her youth pastor, and the youth pastor said, well, what did you expect dating a non-Christian? And then the youth pastor's wife, who was only 2.5 years older than Vera, which is a whole other story in of itself, went and got 2 pieces of construction paper, right, pink and blue, glued them together, and then when it dried, ripped them apart and showed how there was part of the pink on the blue construction paper, started part of the blue on the pink, and told her that when you have sex with someone, you create a soul tie so that they are always with you. And this is the danger of having sex before marriage, is that you now have a soul tie with this boy that needs to be broken, and you'll never be able to have real intimacy with your husband because you now have this problem. And this was really common. Nobody checked in with her on whether this had been consensual. And instead, we really primed girls not to recognize date rape. So, for instance, in Shanti Felton's book, and she was another researcher, and she wrote for women only, for men only. She also wrote a book for teen girls called For Young Women Only. And she asked a question. So I'm about to give you a stat. I do not think this stat is accurate. I think her question was poorly worded. Her possible answer choices were poorly worded. And the way she analyzed the answers was poorly done. But her conclusion was 82% of boys feel either little ability or little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. And so her advice to girls was, if you want to stop it, it is safest to not even start. Now, let's be really clear. 100% of boys have the ability to stop in a makeout situation. And 100% of boys have the responsibility to stop if she says no. And so to tell girls that 82% of boys feel either no responsibility or no ability to stop is simply not okay. But this is what happened. And we heard from girl after girl after girl who said, I'd be kissing and he would push it. He would put his hand somewhere and I'd tell him no. And 3 minutes later, he'd do it again. And I'd tell him no. And 3 minutes later, I'd tell him again. And he'd still do it. And finally, I just stopped saying no. And it wasn't that they wanted it. It was just that they gave up saying no because their no meant nothing. And they were told that this meant that, that they had lost their purity, that they had made a choice. And then a lot of these women ended up marrying the guy because they were told they were married in God's eyes.
Wow.
That stinks. That sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As I'm sitting here hearing you talk, and so many emotions and thoughts are going through my head. I have 2 daughters. And of course, I have a son and 2 daughters. I remember what it was like to be a young Christian boy struggling with everything. I remember what it was. I don't know what it was like to grow up as a teenage girl. I'm going to have to. And I'm trying to figure it out. That's why this book is very interesting. They're young now. My oldest daughter is 6. So it's now, though, to start having these kinds of conversations or these, in age appropriate ways, which, of course, figuring that out is interesting. I'm sure that there's resources, but, it's so eye-opening, like thinking about her, because I grew up in a family of 4 boys and 1 girl. So men outnumbered the women in my family. We were crazy. The boys were all nuts. My mom, even in some ways, because of how much she just, she understood, she had this view growing up that, like when I was growing up, like, hey, it's so funny because she would say, listen, if you get caught in a situation where, like, if you're 18, say, and something happens and there's a 15-year-old girl, you're the one going to jail. They said that to me all the time. And whether or not that was true, whether or not the statistics bear that out, I don't know. But I had this fear, dude. Like, I will never get someone pregnant. It took us a while to get pregnant in my own marriage, I think, because of my own issues. I will never get someone pregnant because I'm just not doing that. And then the second thing, though, was like, you are going to be the one that's the bad guy. You're going to be the one that's like, that everyone's going to blame. It's interesting to hear this because what I'm hearing from you is such an opposite message that so many girls received. And I don't know why I received the one I received. I think my mom was just worried. She didn't want her son to go to jail for doing something. And she really wanted to, all of her boys to feel that and understand that. And of course, she wanted us to treat women with respect. And both my parents talked about that. And we do, and we strive to do that. One of the things I keep wondering about and just wrestling with, like, for instance, the idea of the 2, like, ripping the 2 things apart, like I could see where it was going as you were talking about that. And I'm like, what is the consequence? I guess my question is, what is the consequence? What should the right messaging be? And I'm sure that you get to these kinds of things. I know that this is part of what you're trying to do is bring awareness and bring the right messaging. She deserves better. And I agree, my daughters deserve better. So what is the right messaging? What do we tell our kids about sex? Because, of course, sex is very powerful.
Yeah.
And we don't want them messing around with it. But what do we do? Help me out here. As a dad who's got 2 girls that are going to be coming into this, what help me out with the messaging part of all this.
Okay, well, first of all, in the book, we do have a lot of conversation starters and ways that you can have those conversations. So please, first of all, get She Deserves Better. It will help you walk through that with your kids. A couple of things to know. Information, there is no downside. There is no downside to giving your kids information. We had a very strange generation in the church with the millennials, because if you look at our survey of 7,000 women, Gen X's and boomer women had more sex ed at the point where they graduated high school than millennial women did who grew up in the church. Because in the 90s, basically Christian circles stopped giving any sex ed, and all they did was say abstinence, don't do it. Very, very, very bad things happen when you have sex. So we gave survey takers 10 possible sex ed questions. We said, how many of these could you define at the point where you graduated high school? The more words you knew, the better you did long term. Like, there is no downside to knowing more words. Interestingly, women were more likely to know the words for male anatomy than they were for female anatomy. So we're not teaching women about our own bodies. When women feel ashamed of their periods, when the puberty conversation isn't handled really well, and women feel like, I have to keep all of this secret, their self-esteem goes way down, and that has disastrous effects on marrying abusers, etc. So you really want your kids to know about their bodies. You want them to know about sex. You want them to know as many words as possible. You want them to understand consent. All of those things make girls less likely to have multiple sexual partners, more likely to have high self-esteem, less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. Like, there is absolutely no downside. So I don't know why we stopped giving people education, because that was a really bad idea. Because the less education they have, the more likely they are to be taken advantage of, the more likely they are to be abused in church, the less information they have.
At any age, like 6-year-old.
Yeah, well, age appropriate, but it's so important for kids like 6 years old to know the names for their anatomy, because they have to be able to tell you if something's happening, like just basic things.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, if you have toddlers, read Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. Have you ever seen those books? The Pigeon series?
Oh yeah. Big fan.
They're awesome for teaching consent. Just go get it. Don't let the pigeon drive the bus. But anyway, so just information's good. Then we measured a whole bunch of messaging around sex before marriage. And what we found is that when you give kids threatening messages, that has negative outcomes. When you give them aspirational messages, that does not. That has good outcomes. So telling kids sex is something sacred that is meant for marriage, that doesn't have bad outcomes. Telling kids, if you have sex before marriage, you will never have the intimacy that God wants for you once you are married, that has negative outcomes. So let's not threaten kids. You can tell kids, like, did you ever see the movie Mean Girls? Do you know the movie Mean Girls? Okay, there's this really, it's the meme now.
One of my faves. Yeah,
the gym teacher who's giving the sex ed talk, and he says, like, don't have sex or you will get pregnant and you will die, right? Like that, basically, that is the message that we gave during purity culture. Our books told girls, there's 13 steps to putting on a condom. Condoms don't work. That's not true. Condoms, even with
13 steps.
I don't even know what they are. Like, I know, I tried to figure it out. Like, is one getting in the car to go to the drugstore?
13 steps.
Yeah, like I don't even know what they are. But there's no downside to telling kids, hey, condoms are actually really effective at preventing STDs and pregnancy. They're not perfect, but they're pretty effective. That's okay to tell kids that, because the problem is if you tell kids birth control doesn't work, you will get pregnant, you will get an STD, you will be rendered infertile, you might die. Our kids are all going to have friends who are having sex and who aren't dead, and when they realize that, and they're going to think we lied to them. And so our reasons for not having sex can't be because all of these terrible things will happen to you. Yes, tell them about pregnancies.
We also lied to them that they were going to have great sex.
Yes, that's another issue, is that we bribed them. We bribed kids. And that... That leads to a lot of deconstruction too. And that's a big problem.
Dude.
But you can just tell kids, hey, you know what? You're going to want to have sex because you were made like that. You were made with hormones. You were made to be sexually attracted to people. And when you're with someone that you really love, you're probably going to want to have sex. That's not wise for you at your age. It's too important. It can really mess up your feelings, and I want you to save this for marriage. And here's why. And you can tell them all your own personal reasons and what you think. But it's very important for you to decide what your boundaries are and then make a plan to stick to those boundaries. And even more important than that, honor the boundaries of the person you're with. And if someone isn't honoring your boundaries, that's a red flag. That relationship isn't safe. And I think those are the kinds of messages we need to give.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like the origins of this type of I don't know, theology, philosophy, whatever, that's causing young girls to think this way. I mean, like, is it just like, parenting, or, is this something that's just kind of unique in the church? Because again, like I said, I didn't grow up in the church, so a lot of the concepts and whatnot posed in your book were all pretty foreign to me, because I'm just like, I don't know, like, this sounds like a Christian problem, but I'm curious, like, why
Indeed.
Why did we get to the point where we had to say she deserved better?
Purity culture came out of a really bad time in the 80s. So in the 80s, teen pregnancy rates were through the roof. Rates of sexual behavior was through the roof. Alcohol, drug use was through the roof. And everybody was looking at this. Governments were looking at this. Churches were looking at this, and everyone's freaking out. And we're like, how can we get these teenagers under control? And so governments put in comprehensive sex ed. The church freaked out at that, and the church decided to clamp down on everything. And so for the first time, we had dating wasn't allowed. Dating was considered unchristian. You had to court. You weren't allowed to kiss before the wedding. And when you look at our results over generations, Gen X and Boomers, we all dated. We all were allowed to date. This was not a thing, not being allowed to date. But suddenly among millennials, you had a whole generation where many of them were not allowed to date. And you start seeing people saving the first kiss for the wedding, which was never done before. Even like 200 years ago, people kissed at the engagement. Like like the thought that purity culture is returning to a bygone era. No, this has never been done before. This was a new thing. And it was trying to control teenagers by preventing any possible opportunity for them to mess up. So we're not going to let kids date. We're not going to let kids touch each other. We're going to separate the genders as much as possible. We're going to tell them to get married super early. Yeah. We're going to tell girls that you are super dangerous to boys. And so you're going to cover up, and boys can't help it. And so we've got to make sure that boys aren't tempted, because everything is just a powder keg ready to explode. And what we never did was teach kids how to be emotionally healthy, and that their emotions matter, and that their bodies, there's nothing wrong with their bodies. It's like we just tried to control things. We put a lot of shame on it. And certainly there was a lot of these messages in the wider culture too. But the church itself did a lot of damage in those years.
Yeah, I'm curious if you think, a lot of the purity culture stuff is what caused famous preachers like Ravi Zacharias or the Hillsong guy Joel Houston, host something like that. If it's sort of like purity culture meets Me Too movement. And what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's purity culture meets male entitlement, because so much of our teaching has been men can't help it. This is how God made men. God made men to lust. God made men to have this insatiable sex drive. God made men to have sexual needs, and women are here to fulfill those needs. And when you combine those two things, it's really quite toxic. Here, let me give you an example. There was a curriculum marketed to girls ages 8 to 12 called Secret Keeper Girl. It's now rebranded to True Girl, but it's pretty much the same today. It was an event that happened all across North America. Several 100,000 girls went to this thing. And they had this test for modesty called the Raise and Praise test. So you were supposed to put your arms up in the air, and if your belly showed, it meant that you weren't being modest. And the reason was because bellies are intoxicating. And then the author, Dana Gresh, had this conversation moms were supposed to have with their daughters to explain this. So you were supposed to say, do you remember what intoxicating means? It means that you get out of control, like when you're drunk. And God created our bodies to intoxicate men. But you're only supposed to intoxicate one man, your future husband. So we need to cover up to make sure that you don't intoxicate other men. Okay, let's dissect that. Because what she is saying is that an 8-year-old's belly has the ability to make an adult man out of control.
That's horrible.
It's horrifying. How did nobody say anything?
Yeah, that's horrifying.
That is horrifying. You know, I just want to live in a church.
What a horrifying place for a little girl to live.
I know. And imagine what's going to happen when she's 11 and someone gropes her. She's going to think, what was I wearing? You know, I just want to be in a church where if an adult man says that a 12-year-old is dressed to be a stumbling block, that instead of handing the 12-year-old a sweater, we freak out on the adult man.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Call the police.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's so I'm trying to kind of get my thoughts even about me, because so many things are running through my mind. Partly because I experienced this growing up, partly because it feels like my home life experience was such that almost like, I don't know. I want to be careful how I say it, but my home life was such that it's almost like I didn't quite get the, feel the weight of what you're bringing here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, like I said, like I felt like, well, it would be my fault.
Mm-hmm.
Like, essentially, if anything went wrong, I'm the one getting blamed. I'm the one getting screwed, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
I'm the one that things are not, are going to be in it. So many things are like just running through my head. As I'm processing.
Well, here, can I try to add something to that?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
I think what we did find in both of our surveys is that evangelical women have artificially lowered libidos. Like, we have lower libidos than the secular world. We want sex less, and we don't enjoy sex as much, and we have more sexual pain. And I believe a lot of that goes back to the messaging that has been given specifically to women and to girls. And a lot of guys don't see it because it's in our media. It's from the Instagram followers that girls follow. It's from Brio magazine that was marketed to girls from Focus on the Family. It's from these books that were given to girls. It's from when they divide up the boys and the girls. Like, it's girls that are given the modesty talks. Boys aren't told all this stuff about it's girls who are told this. And when we tell girls all of these messages, it leads to really negative outcomes for women. And I think a lot of men are married to women and who, these women might want sex more, but they just don't. They just don't like it that much. It's never been that enjoyable. And you're like, I don't know what to do. And it could be that the answer is that a lot of these messages that she internalized as a kid and as a teenager have just made men seem gross. Sex seemed gross and my body seemed dangerous. Sure. And how are you supposed to enjoy sex if your body is dangerous and men are gross?
You can't.
Yeah. And so we need to undo this messaging. And I think my plea for men is just to understand the weight of what was put on women, even if you never heard it, because you weren't the target audience for a lot of this stuff. Right?
Yes, that's very good. Yes. And it helps me realize, and other men like me, I hope I'm not the only one. It makes me realize that just because something isn't immediately apparent to me, or if I hear it, I'm skeptical. I'm like, whoa, really? Mm-hmm. That doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that has been really hard for a lot of people. Because I grew up in this church, I would have seen that.
Yeah,
I would have experienced that, or that would have been getting out of our own experience and trying to enter into the experience of someone else. Because you're absolutely right, dude. I didn't read any of that crap. I didn't get any of it. I didn't get stuff for boys. I didn't read the crap I didn't know. I had no care about it. I didn't want to read it. I'm sure my parents wanted me to read it. I had no interest in reading it. Give me something else. I didn't like any of that stuff till I got to college and I became a theologian, started studying theology. Then I started caring about the Bible, which isn't everyone, but that was just me. But what? So I guess here's the thing that's it keeps coming back to me, and the messaging I hear, that changing that messaging is so important. How big of a deal? How much of a big deal is sex? What I mean is, have we made it just way too big of a deal in the evangelical community? Jesus hardly talks about it.
Yep. Did you see?
I'm trying to think of some lines, very real, just adultery.
Yeah.
And don't look, but that they talked about that all the freaking time.
Yeah.
We never learned about the other more important teachings of Jesus. Everything was about how to keep your member in your pants for boys.
I don't know if everyone's watching on YouTube versus listening on a podcast, but on page 40 of She Deserves Better, we have some word clouds. And
I thought that was fascinating.
This side is what's in the New Testament, and this side is what is in books for girls. And in the New Testament, it's all about like Jesus, love, pray, believe, faith, glory, peace, kingdom of God, Holy Spirit. And in books for girls, it's love, sex, wait, husband,
virginity,
purity. It's like it's
virginity has to be in there like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and you know, when I was in youth group in the 80s in Canada, so this is before American purity culture came in. Our main focus in youth group was like evangelism. Let's tell your testimony. Let's pray for missions in the world. Let's figure out how to change our high schools for Christ. And my daughter's experience in youth group 25 years later was totally different because for them, it was all purity, purity, purity. And so something really changed. And when you look at our survey results, the millennial generation are the most likely to have believed all the toxic stuff as teenagers. Like they're more likely to have believed it than Gen X and boomers. But they're also the least likely to believe it today. So millennials believed it as teens and have largely left it behind. Gen X and boomers didn't necessarily believe it as much, but they're more likely to believe it now because we didn't experience the harm in the same way. And so a lot of us are still passing it along because we don't realize how harmful it was. But for the millennials, it was really harmful because it made their faith only about their hymens and not about your heart and what it really means to follow Christ.
Preach. That should be your next sermon.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. So I'm curious, like you've done a lot of podcast interviews, kind of promoting the book and what have you. And I was debating whether or not to ask you at the top of the interview or not, but I definitely want to ask you now is, do you find that the types of questions that you get from men interviewing you are different than the types of questions that you get from women? Because I'd imagine like you were on a friend's podcast, Lori Brown, and you know, I know that she herself has gone through some stuff within the church. So like the way that she would come into an interview would probably be informed by her own life experiences and what have you. And, you know, just like Josh and myself, and Josh has shared some of the stories of him growing up in the church and the things that he was exposed to. Like, do you find that the questions are different?
I think a lot of men are still trying to figure this out because they didn't experience it. Right. And for them, a lot of it seems self-evident. I mean, don't guys have a harder time stopping? Don't we need to warn girls about guys have a harder time stopping? Like, how can you say that we shouldn't say that? And so I've had to explain the harm a lot more, I think, with some of the men. I think with women, it's interesting the things that have really resonated with a lot of women, because I've ended up talking about a lot of the boundary stuff with women, which I wasn't expecting. I thought that most people would want to talk about the modesty and consent stuff. But some of the bigger picture things about you don't matter, you don't have a voice, sticking up for yourself is wrong. That's the root of a lot of women's pain. And even trying to figure that out as an adult. And so I've gotten into some interesting conversations with that about women, because I think that's more foundational is how can we have healthy relationships if I'm not allowed to matter? And if thinking about what I want is somehow unchristian. So we just need so much of a more robust understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
And what it means to die to self. Because the idea of dying to self, I think we have made it into being nothing. And that's not what Jesus meant. He just meant be focused on the kingdom. Make the kingdom. And you know what? We're part of the kingdom. You know, we're made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And Jesus has a special calling on each of our lives. And that means that we have to matter.
I want to give you just one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. And this is kind of like your opportunity to preach. if you are a, teenage girl listening to this, having read your book, and you have not, given your life to Jesus yet, but you're listening to this and you're reading, you're like, why the heck would I want to give my life to Jesus at this stage of my life, knowing that like all this stuff is going on, and I don't want to necessarily go into the church and become an activist, and try to reform the teaching and what have you. Maybe I'll just wait until, I'm in my 20s or something like that. So like what message would you have for that girl?
Is that Jesus isn't a set of beliefs. Jesus is a person. And there's nothing like going through life with someone who honestly loves you and who is there. And that's why we need to follow Christ, is not because, we want to be an activist or we feel like we have to do all these things. It's just that life isn't worth living alone. It's too hard. And the real source of joy and self-esteem is knowing there's a creator who values you and that you do have purpose. That's what I would say to girls. I think my message to parents would be a little bit different. The good news that I would want parents to really understand is that church attendance is a good thing. Believing in Jesus is a good thing. Long-term, people who go to church, better marriages, better self-esteem, better mental health. Yay us. Like it's good, good, good. But there's a huge but. And that's that when girls internalize these toxic teachings, the benefits of church disappear. And many girls would have been better off if they hadn't gone to church at all, if you look at their future marital outcomes and self-esteem outcomes. And we don't want that for our daughters. And so as parents, we need to make sure that our church is not hurting our kids, because a lot of churches have. So get involved in youth group, find out what they're teaching, talk to your youth leaders, because it may not be that they're deliberately doing anything bad. They just may not know any different. So give them a copy of She Deserves Better. Like, let's start having these conversations, because the church can change. It really can. And church is good, but we can't keep doing this, because we hurt a lot of people during purity culture, and it needs to stop.
Yeah. So what's I guess what's next for you and your work in this area?
Oh, we keep being asked if we're going to do a He Deserves Better. I mean, I would love to, but we're under contract. We're writing a marriage book right now. So our next thing, we have two big projects. So we're doing a big, huge project on sexual pain with a bunch of pelvic floor physiotherapists to get to the bottom of religious affiliation, a religious association with sexual pain. And then we're doing a huge marriage book, trying to create healthy marriages from the ground up. So I don't know, maybe we'll eventually get to that too, but yeah, we're just trying to get more research into the Christian world so that we can judge by fruit.
That's awesome. And where can people find out more about you, your book, and everything else you're doing? Yeah,
so I'm at baremarriage.com, BARE, baremarriage.com. And my books, Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better. If you click on books, they're right there. We have courses to talk to your kids about puberty and sex. And of course, we have our Bare Marriage podcast every Thursday. So you can come check that out.
That's really awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sheila, for spending some time with us. And good luck to all the wonderful work you're doing. And this wasn't as uncomfortable of a conversation as I thought it was.
Good.
Like, maybe I need to read more books about sex.
That's so funny, dude.
Well, thank you again. And
just embrace it, dude. Embrace it.
Yes, I will. Well, thank you to our Faithful Politics listeners.